J'ai déjà dormi sous la neige, un peu. Ça fait 7 ans maintenant, finalement, que je passe l'hiver dehors. 7 ans. Et tant bien que mal, j'ai réussi à dormir quand même dehors. Je ne savais pas, hein, moi je pensais qu'on n'y survivait pas.
En fait, quand on regarde bien, l'homme, il régresse. Il retourne dans son passé. Il n'avance pas, il recule. Il n'y a que la technologie qui suit les époques. Mais nous ne faisons que de reculer. Eh oui, on recule. On n'a pas compris, on doit avancer. Un jour ou l'autre, c'est comme ça. Tout va être moderne, mais l'être humain va redevenir préhistorique.
Ils auraient dû faire quelque chose. Dès le départ, qu'ils ont vu qu'il y avait quelques centaines de SDF à la rue, c'est là qu'ils auraient dû faire quelque chose. Là, c'est plus des centaines qu'il y a, c'est des milliers. Il y en a partout. À chaque point de rue, il y en a. Et le soir, c'est encore pire. On est des fantômes.
Okay, so I want to welcome everyone to the panel following On the Edge of the World, screening here at the festival. And I want to introduce our moderator, Scott Charland, who's from Brattleboro, or is a resident of Brattleboro, works very actively with Groundworks Collective. And take it away, Scott.
Thank you, Jennifer. So first off, I'd just like to say that was a very powerful film for me. And you know, some of the themes that were raised in there, you know, we're going to see that there are some similarities to what's going on here in Brattleboro and some differences from, you know, what's happening in Paris. So we're going to dive into that a little bit. And here on stage with me, we have Rebeka Lawrence Gomez. She's from Pathways Vermont. And we also have Hillary Melton to my right. She's the executive director of Pathways Vermont. And Sherry from the Women's Freedom Center to my left. Thank you, Sherry, for being here. And I wanted each person on the panel here to give us a brief description of your organization's work and what is your initial reaction to the film in light of in light of what is happening here on the ground in Brattleboro. So maybe Hillary, you could start us off.
Sure. Oh, that's so loud. I'm Hillary Melton. I'm the executive director of Pathways Vermont, and we provide housing first services in Vermont. We're a statewide organization, as well as some other mental health programs that we have. And the movie to me was quite depressing, actually. I started out working with homelessness, doing street outreach, and so it took me back to a time when I was doing street outreach in the, Boston and New York City. Very similar. It's listening to people's stories was similar to that work, and I spent several years handing out blankets and food and trying to get people to come into shelters. And in New York City, I met a man, a Dr. Sam Sambaros, who is the founder of Housing First, and this was about 1992, and we started the Housing First movement then, and I was part of the first Housing First organization. So switching from providing services to people on the streets and in shelters to a focus on housing and supporting people no matter what their histories were or what they were experiencing, whether it was struggling with substance abuse or mental health challenges. Putting people directly into apartments was very successful and continues to be successful. So I've spent a good deal of my life working on housing and supporting people in housing, including in Brattleboro. About 5 years ago, Vermont got a grant to bring Housing First to the state, and we've been working hard to try to provide Housing First services and have housed over 200 people since we've gotten that grant. So a little bit about Pathways and my history and where that movie, it's 25 years later, and it's the same stories and the same pain and the same people out on the street. So that's the depressing part for me, that it's we continue as a world to struggle with the same problems. But I also believe there's hope, because I think that focus on housing and supporting people, I know that it works. I've seen people with as many struggles as we saw tonight on the film do very well in housing with supports.
Yeah, and Housing First is a model that we've looked at for Groundworks Collaborative as well, and that's something that's going to be much more of a focus in the very short future. So we'll be seeing more of that in Brattleboro.
Awesome.
Thank you, Hillary. And I'd like to turn over to Rebeka now. You can share mics. And go ahead, Rebeka.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm Rebeka Lawrence Gomez. I have had the privilege of working with Hillary with Pathways Vermont since we started in 2009. Yeah, and of course the movie was touching and so hard to see. Honestly, to see people who are in such challenging circumstances, and also made me so grateful to be a part of a team and a program that really has been able to work with folks in Vermont, and there are folks in Vermont who have had that experience, who have camped outside, who have had years where they, go camping and then maybe go in the shelter, and to know that, there are still folks who are experiencing that, but that we've been able to allow, and support folks to have access to housing, without conditions and without following particular rules or acting a certain way, or still supporting people who are maybe still experiencing some of these alternative realities and such. So yeah.
Thank you, Rebeka. And Sherry, tell us a little bit about your organization and the work that you do, and how it relates to the movie and what's happening here in Brattleboro.
Yeah, so folks may still be familiar with the Women's Freedom Center by our earlier name, which was the Women's Crisis Center. We're the Domestic and Sexual Violence Resource Agency for Windham and Southern Windsor counties, and we have now been in the community for 41 years. And I was also really struck by just the poignant stories in the film, and a lot of our work really highlights for us the gendered nature of a lot of social issues, including homelessness. And folks may be aware that domestic violence is actually the leading cause of female homelessness. So it may be directly linked to why someone's homeless. And as we can all probably imagine, there are additional risks for women once they are homeless as well, that are very gendered. So there's a lot of that kind of woven in there. Another statistic that can be pretty startling: women in the general population, 1 in 3 women will experience domestic or sexual violence, but among homeless women, about 92% have experienced one or the other, sometimes both, sometimes a long history. So it really, sort of highlights the cumulative nature in a lifetime of experiencing that trauma, which can lead to homelessness, which can, it can start a downward spiral. So it's incredibly important that we're able to provide some sustainable ways for folks to turn their lives around.
Thank you, Sherry, and that 90% figure is shocking.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing. Now I wanted to turn to the audience and ask the audience, how many people here are involved in some way in an organization or government agency that is doing any work related to poverty, homelessness, or food insecurity? Can I just get a show of hands to see who we have here in the audience? I see Tom there, maybe a couple other people, so we have some experience there. Now, has anyone heard the term, or I guess a saying that you hear, why don't the homeless just pull themselves up by the bootstraps? Has anyone heard that before? Anyone familiar with that saying, pull yourself up by the bootstraps? A few people have heard it. So my next question for the panel, I wanted to ask, there was one man in the film that mentions he had gone to a temp agency, he was looking for work, and he got work from them year after year, and then they changed their policy. All of a sudden he couldn't get work because he didn't have a permanent address, and they wouldn't accept the hostel as an appropriate address, therefore he could not work. So in Brattleboro, in Vermont, in the US, what are some of the barriers and some of the challenges that are put up that prevent the homeless from getting out of their situation and accessing work and accessing services? So open for whoever wants to start off with that one.
Sure, I guess I could respond maybe to start. As with every issue, of course, it's so individualized, and I think that's important to always keep in mind that every single person experiencing homelessness has their own story and their own journey and their own, reasons or situations why they are where they are. I would comment and reflect here in Vermont, we see a lot of folks where certainly economic issues, whether it's perhaps they had a history of working and something happened and they're no longer able to work. 90% of the people we serve self-identify as having had a serious trauma history or some kind of traumatic event in their life. And that can be anything. That can be the loss of a loved one. That could be a sexual assault. That can be, loss of a job or anything like that. But certainly that experience with an extreme difficulty or a period of difficulty, domestic violence certainly is another example of something that can just greatly affect someone's life and the way things have occurred for them. We don't have a lot of housing stock in Vermont. That's a common issue. And we're also very small, close-knit communities, which has its amazing blessings and wonderful things. But, here in Brattleboro, if you have a rough time in an apartment and a really negative experience with a landlord, there's a good chance that a lot of other landlords, will know who you are. And be familiar with that experience. So some quick examples that come to mind.
Thank you, Rebeka. Hillary, I'd like to ask the same question to you. What are some of the barriers that are placed by the system on individuals?
I think affordable housing is probably the biggest. I think if we, I don't know how many people remember a time when there wasn't homelessness, but there was, and certainly in my lifetime, than not, this epidemic of homelessness, and there was much more affordable housing. And I think it's next to impossible. I'm so amazed by people who can be homeless and hold down a job. It's incredible that somebody could do that, to not necessarily know where you're going to sleep the night, or where you could use the bathroom, or where you could get changed, and still get up and go to work at all, I think is tremendous. I'm a big believer in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and if you don't have your basic needs met, it's almost impossible to do the next steps, or whether it's work or wellness or health, or if you don't know where you're going to sleep tonight, it's impossible, I think, near impossible to take care of any of your other basic needs.
And that's really the foundation of the Housing First model, is that you have those basic needs before you can move on to the next step.
Exactly.
So housing starts, the baseline, the foundation of all the other needs that you need to get met.
Yes, absolutely. Not too long ago, some of us in Addison County, we spent the night out on a cold night. It wasn't quite winter, but the debilitating, if you spend a night out and you can't sleep, just for us that one night was so debilitating. It took several days to even get over that. It's amazing how people can do day after day after day and that older woman in the movie was 7 years on the street sitting in that corner. It's amazing and horrific all in one fell swoop.
Thank you. And Sherry, I wanted to allow you to chime in as well about, what are those barriers that the system is creating for individuals maybe that are experiencing homelessness?
Well, I would say, similar kinds of barriers that everyone potentially faces. And then, of course, for survivors, it's interesting that you mentioned the kind of knee-jerk question that often comes up around homelessness. You know, why don't people just do X, Y, or Z, as if it was just doing that could automatically turn somebody's cumulative life history around. And then the, you know, stereotypical first question we often hear with survivors of domestic violence is, why doesn't she just leave? The same kind of thing, as if there was readily affordable housing and people could just instantly turn that around. So, you know, the survivors that we work with are facing all the same issues in economic times and Vermont communities that others are, and they may also have a lot of damage control that we have to, or sort of minimizing past damage that's happened if credit histories have been ruined or landlord-tenant situations have been not resolved in their favor in some way because of domestic violence that's happened. So there's a lot of repair that often needs to happen. And then beyond that, I was so struck in the film by just aside from all of the tangible hazards of living out in the elements and the health and all of that, just the line of that woman that said, you know, you don't dream. Thought, oh my gosh, you know, aside from just not getting enough REM sleep, emotionally, just to not dream, like the reality that they're experiencing right beside people passing by, going home. There's such parallel existences happening at the same time. So it's very powerful in that sense.
And I wanted to ask a follow-up question to that. What can be done locally to address this issue? You know, you had this one woman mentioning that violence was the reason that she ended up on the street for 7 years. What are some things that can be done locally to either prevent or address these issues?
Wow, that really is the fundamental question, right? And, you know, another question that we ask is, why is it so often victims of violence that end up having to leave just to be safe or couch surf or go to another shelter? It's rarely perpetrators that are having to upheave their lives in that way. So that's a separate question from the homelessness issue. What I can say is, you know, here in Vermont, there are 15 domestic and sexual violence programs around the state. 10 of us have shelters, so including the Women's Freedom Center. We have a confidentially located shelter. We are often full. And that's the same for programs around the country. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to have a place after that emergency shelter. Again, same issue, right? It touches on, what does long-term affordable housing look like? Even if we can just get someone safely out of the crisis, she doesn't feel like she has anywhere, and I'm using the gendered pronoun that we typically see. There's no place safe to go. Sometimes women, especially with kids, are returning back to a situation because they don't feel like they have anywhere else to be. So certainly more funding needs to happen. I would say more consequences for batterers so that maybe they're off the streets longer. So survivors have a longer time to really plan for what they want or need to do next. So there's a lot there. It's hard to condense that answer.
I know it's a very complicated problem, so there's only complicated solutions. There's no easy fix for any of these things. One man in the film mentioned, you know, the price per square meter in his neighborhood is very high, and Rebeka mentioned that, you know, the housing stock is limited in Brattleboro and Windham County. And I wanted to read a stat. The vacancy rate for multi-unit apartment housing in Windham County is 0.5%. So it's less than 1% of, at any given time, the amount of housing stock that's available to rent out. So that means basically 99.5% full. That's a stark number. And experts say generally in a housing market that's healthy, you're going to see between 3 and 6%. So we definitely have a shortage of available housing. So what are some of the challenges that someone faces when they are ready to find housing, other than just the stark number that you just don't have that many places?
Sure, that's probably the number one. And, you know, I have to mention the appreciation that we do feel for many landlords here in the Brattleboro area in Windham County who have opened up their units to folks who might not have the strongest rental history or excellent credit reports, or perhaps, you know, some previous experiences with our criminal justice system. So would certainly want to acknowledge and thank them for that. And I'm sorry, I forgot your question. Do you mind repeating it, Scott? Distracted by my landlord praise.
What are the challenges faced by the homeless when they're trying to find housing?
Sure, and I'm sure it varies person by person. I think, again, personal experiences, skills that we might take for granted or that maybe we learned from a parent who has, taught us or something in terms of, how do you present yourself to a landlord? What are some of the things you say? What are some of the things you don't say? How do you complete an application? If someone perhaps struggles with reading or writing, filling out a 10-page application with somewhat complicated questions can be quite daunting. So I think it's, kind of things like that that maybe I took for granted the first time I applied for an apartment, having sufficient funds for not only rent, but also a security deposit. Barriers one might face in terms of if they've had a pet. Some folks, we saw actually in the movie, several folks who had animals, whom perhaps are their closest relationships. And so, in the housing market in Vermont, for most people, it can be challenging to find an apartment with a pet. So I think all of those pieces certainly affect beyond just the minimal housing stock.
Thank you. And I'd like to ask one more question of the panel before we open it up to audience questions. One person mentioned that some places are off limits to the homeless. And recently in Boise, Idaho, there was a federal court that ruled municipal ordinances that ban sleeping or camping in public places are illegal when people do not have an alternative place to sleep. So basically, it's saying if you have no other reasonable place to go, you should still be able to camp in public. And Brattleboro has one of those ordinances. So I wanted to, open that up and say, what are some reasons why an ordinance like that may have been put into place? What are some of the challenges that we face in overturning something like that? When now we have this federal ruling that says that can't really be happening in Brattleboro. I don't know if anybody wants to speak to some of the reasons why we might have an ordinance like that and why we might want to get rid of it.
I think that whatever energy we have should be focused on housing and supporting people and supporting good work. So that's kind of where I land on it. That criminalizing homelessness seems just like a waste of energy all around. And I think it comes from, people are probably after decades, they're tired of it, and they're tired of seeing people in the streets or in public places. And I know it comes from frustration and lots of other things, but I feel a responsibility as a human being to focus my energy on housing and supporting people and trying to make a difference, because people aren't there by choice. It's not like, I think everybody that I've worked with, and I've worked with thousands of people, they always want a place to live, and when provided with an affordable housing, walk through that door and are oftentimes successful. More often than not, people given the opportunity for affordable housing and a safe place to live do well, and I choose to focus on that.
And I see just stigma as such a big part of that whole conversation. And I don't know if Sherry or Rebeka would like to speak about, are there some ways that we can overcome stigma in the community here? And what are some steps we can start taking?
Well, I think recognizing that for many of us, circumstances could still, one leg of the table goes, it doesn't take a lot. There are a lot of people that are close enough to that margin that seeing ourselves in that position, I would say, is part of it. And, understanding the frustration, I think, but not the frustration that there's a lot wrong with the social system, but not turning that frustration against folks that are homeless, but turning it against the system, I would say. That's really key.
That's a great point. There's a great video that Toronto produced, I believe in the last few months. It's about a minute and a half long, and it basically sums up what you just said in a moment about turning that anger and sort of frustration about, I don't want a shelter in my neighborhood, I don't want this in my neighborhood, to, well, you can turn that frustration and anger into positive energy. And let's talk about the system and how we can change the system to prevent this from happening in the first place.
Yeah, and I think realizing too, this is not some other species of human being. They're human beings, and to the extent that we're all connected in some web, we have a say in that. You know how our culture treats them, and for the sake of safety, it makes a lot of sense that people would want to be somewhere in the center of things and not off in the woods where they may be even less safe. So it's understandable, and I think we need to own that.
And I really liked how the film gave a voice to those who are seen as being voiceless typically, and
Absolutely.
it really just let them speak.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
So now I'd like to open it up to the audience if there are any questions out there. Jen, you have a microphone if are there any questions?
Yeah, I'll just give you one question. Maybe this can be a good closing for you guys, because we have another screening. When I watched this film after living in New York for 15 years, where homelessness is really evident, the stigma question for me is always that thing, is that you stop thinking about them as people. And when I watched this film, I don't think I'd ever, and I guess I'm saying that it's obvious, but it wasn't obvious to me, some of the struggles that this is about their experience. I'm always thinking about, like, people worry about their circumstances, how they got there, why they're there, but they're there, there's no privacy. And the woman who lost all of her pictures of her children, that just, it's something I'd never thought about, that you lose your history when you're homeless. And I guess I wanted to just ask you, is like, how much is sort of overcoming that, I guess you're calling it a stigma, part of like the work that you do?
I guess it's a great question, really. And just to say, I would encourage anyone, if you ever have the opportunity to volunteer or connect with, I recommend Groundworks or Pathways. We're both local, or with, any group here in the community or in your community. People are so people. That's really the best part is, once you connect with someone, once you meet them, you're like, oh my word. Of course, their life is much different than mine, and their struggles or where they're at in this moment look so much different. But yeah, at the end of the day, like, it can be super fun, just to make a new connection with someone who you maybe would not have. But, and I think that's a big part of it, because the next time you see someone who's homeless, you might just be a little bit more comfortable in your skin, and the way you interact with them might be a little bit different than you had previously. Yeah, and I think, it's each of us. It's every single one of us just acting a little bit differently when we leave here, or when we finish trick-or-treating, whatever it is, and just responding differently and being like, my gosh, you're just a person in my community too. And asking people, like, say, like, hey, just treating them like a human, like you would someone maybe you bumped into on the subway or something, so.
Hillary, would you like to add to that?
I just have so many feelings. I've had so many relationships with people who've been on the streets. Just a long history of knowing so many people that it never feels anonymous to me or stigmatizing. It's a really hard place to be. I have nothing but feelings of support for people that are going through that. And I think I really don't like the word the homeless. I prefer to use the word which helps me, people who are experiencing homelessness, because I don't think a label that stays with you over time is helpful. I think there's a lot of people who've experienced homelessness, but it doesn't make them, the homeless. So doing things like that for me to help separate that it's an experience that people are having, that it's not who they are as a person, because I think labels stick to people, and if we create housing that is, this is where formerly homeless people now live, or this is where formerly homeless veterans now live, I think that's stigmatizing. So I think that there are ways that we can, with language and with integrating people into community and valuing people as people, that we can help promote community versus stigmatizing and separating, labeling people. So that's something that helps me.
Yeah, labeling is a big thing, and I've used that a lot in my trainings in the past. Letting people feel what it's like to be a label, and is it better to be a label, or is it better to be a person?
Right.
And how do you want to be treated? So yeah, that's great. And Sherry, would you like to add to the conversation on stigma?
Yeah, I mean, it was so beautifully said already. I absolutely agree. Homelessness is a condition, and it really could happen to anyone. And for us to keep that in mind, people first, right? Always comes back to that, people first, with a particular circumstance or condition perhaps, but people first, I think, is the bottom line.
Thank you, Sherry.
Thank you.
Well, I think we're going to close up now, and I just wanted to let everyone know November 5th and November 7th, the Groundworks Collaborative, which was formerly the Drop-In Center and Morningside Shelter, will be having the training for the Overflow Shelter, the seasonal shelter, at the First Baptist Church. And in between those two events, during the gallery walk on Friday, we're going to be doing a Voices Live with the Commons. It's going to be Myths and Realities of Homelessness, and that's going to start at 6 p.m. on Friday. Be part of it's number 29 on your gallery walk maps, so come check us out on Friday night next week. And yeah, I just wanted to close with a message of hope. And one person in the film, he mentioned, he always keeps his smile. He believes that even though he's 60 years old, good things are still coming. And I believe that that's really the ultimate message here. And I think Brattleboro, as a small community, we really have a chance to make an impact and a difference in what's going on right here. And I see that happening. I see the right people, the people that are on stage, people that are out there in the community right now doing all this wonderful work, and it's going to happen together as one community. Thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you, guys.